Alright, so this video might get a few comments to the contrary. Let's do it!
Rafi's Rants!
Hola, you amazing artist, and welcome to the studio. Today, I'm going to talk about something that I wasn't necessarily aware was a thing. One of the rogue artists that follow us on Patreon, he put together an art show, and I guess he was talking to one of his colleagues, and his colleague made it a point to state, well, what you do, that's not fine art, that's illustration. I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, people are playing that game like, well, that's not fine art, that's illustration, blah, 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 blah. So I'm going to give my opinion on this because, I have an opinion. Guys, why are people arguing semantics about art?
I was literally so confused by this. When this cropped up on our radar, I was like, oh no. Did I stumble into an alternate reality or something? Because I'm pretty sure that I have a working understanding of illustration.
So apparently in doing research and finding that this has been a thing, in my research in this age-old argument, which I pretty much am thinking that it is attached to the term digital art as well.
Being me, I was like, okay, let me just make sure that I haven't been living under a rock for the last 20 years and look up the definition of illustration, which is literally imagery that's commissioned for or designed to accompany a specific text, i.e. in a book.
Right.
Or on a poster. I'm like, okay. That's pretty much what I thought.
So this is where the argument gets a little bit confusing because some proponents that illustration is not fine art say that it is because the person is getting direction, so they are illustrating something. So the fact that a portrait could be fine art, but an illustration is not.
I literally looked up, why are people arguing about illustration versus fine art? And y'all, I found some articles. And I left these articles thinking, like, you guys are confused. I'm here to help you out, okay? One of the articles said that if the artist doesn't have the final say in how the work looks, then it's considered illustration. And I was like, but wait a second. I do commissions where the final say is like a collaboration between myself and the person who commissioned it, so.
Yeah, whenever I've done a portrait, I make sure that they see it and they give me the okay. And if they have anything that they want to change, I change it.
That's just called a commission, which, by the way, a lot of the great masters did those and made their living doing those. Another article made the argument that if it's a design meant to enhance something like a shoe or a shirt, like they basically said, like, this floral print, it's an illustration, and I was like, oh no, honey, that's commercial art.
That's commercial art.
That's not illustration.
And Dali enhanced the phone by putting a lobster on it. That's not considered an illustration. Somebody creates something and it's digital art, it's not automatically an illustration. An illustration is something that illustrates something, right? And so, like, then they try to make the argument saying that, well, if the artist had an intent and they had a story in their head, then it's still an illustration. And I'm like, that just describes all the art that I create. The majority of the art that I create, I've got some kind of story from my life that is in my head. And yes, the piece is depicting something that is based on that. It is not illustrating the story line for line. It is not a fictional story. Nobody hired me to, like, there is so many lines that get crossed in this thing that I honestly, anytime that I've gotten contacted by somebody and they're telling me this, I'm like, don't listen to them. They just sound like idiots. Feels like there's always some opinion that is gonna like, well, that's not real art. That's not fine art. That's this other thing.
Like a threshold. Somebody in the art world is like, they've stopped arguing arduously about commercial art versus fine art. Somebody throw some shade at an illustrator.
Despite all the, like, back and forth when it comes to, like, whether or not something is illustration and this is illustration because whatever, honestly, it seems to be more of an argument of, like, status. Like, what is more important? What is more whatever? And this is because the whole illustration argument comes from a bygone era. It comes from before when, like, with the printing press, you were able to do signage and advertising, and they wanted to put paintings in advertising because it catches attention. And so, like, those things were considered illustrations. Then you had illustrations in books, which were freaking awesome because now you had artwork in books that was able to illustrate the story that was in front of you.
The only art that I had access to on a consistent basis growing up was illustration.
Right.
My parents weren't art collectors. I wasn't in art programs. I wasn't exposed to galleries and fine art and things of that nature. I developed my love for art because of illustration.
Right.
And because of music, because of things that I had access to. So I've always considered illustration to be fine art. So I was taken aback, like, what the heck? Illustration's being attacked? Like, I thought illustration was safe from the it's not arters, and now it's being accused of witchcraft?
The more we got into, like, digital art and different things, that's when people started to throw around the word illustration as if it was a bad word.
Also, I have no problem with people saying this type of art is this is commercial art, this is applied art, this is illustration. I only take issue with it being used as a derogatory term. Since when is being an illustrator a bad thing? Since when is illustration a bad word that people are using to put other people down?
Norman Rockwell is considered a painter. He is considered an artist, and a lot of people will argue back and forth, well, he's an artist. No, he was an illustrator. You know, a lot of the things that he did were like commercial and blah, 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 blah. And so people try to use the word illustration as something that is a negative. But like Norman Rockwell's, one of his paintings sold in auction for like $16 million. Like, and illustration, I've gone to the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, and I've gone to several fine art museums, and there are sections that have illustrations of the time.
Another article, as you said, made the argument that if it can be reproduced, like in the case of music, then it's illustration. I'm like, okay, so they threw the same shade at lithographs back in the day. They were like, that's not art. Who knows what they called it back then before it got the term lithograph.
Well, Picasso was doing them.
And I'm like, let me help you out again. Those already have a name. They're called prints or lithographs or block prints or reproductions. Yeah. They're not illustrations unless they're illustrations.
Unless they're illustrations. Unless you are hired to illustrate a book. Well, what about artists who do prints of their work? Does that mean that immediately it becomes an illustration? Like, I don't. Guys, there are better things to argue and fight for in the art world. And if you find yourself pointing a finger and telling somebody, well, that's not fine art, that's just blah, 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 then let me tell you, you're part of the problem, because we should all be working together. We should all be uplifting each other, and we should all be freaking much more awesome to each other, because every artist out there that you meet is the underdog. We're the ones that need to get ourselves out there and put ourselves out there and face rejection and face fears and face all these things. And if you're going to sit there and be part of the problem, then that's it. That's what you are, is just part of the problem. Illustration is a specific thing. You're illustrating a story, or you're illustrating something in an article, or you're illustrating a commercial brand or something like that. That's very specific. That is a thing. It's not a craft. Whatever you're doing, whether or not you're doing it on a computer or you're doing it's digital art or it's whatever, all that is the medium. If you are illustrating a book, then it is an illustration. If you are taking the concept of a book and you are rewriting it in your head and redoing the story, and you are putting your own interpretation out there where you are thinking for yourself, you did not get paid to do an illustration for a book, then it is not an illustration. I don't care what anyone says. It is something that came from your own mind and you created it. The argument doesn't make sense. It's the same thing that happened it's around the same time that photography came out, and people were like, oh no, that means that the art world is going to go away. And here's the interesting thing about that, is that the fine art from the old masters, right? That was because there was no photography. So you got portraits done because it wasn't like somebody could come by and take a photograph of you. So at that point, well, is that illustration? Is that photography? All the fine art from back in the day? Because, I mean, they were commissioned to do something. And, they had to get the approval upon the end, because if not, they didn't get paid for the art.
Right. They weren't going around painting portraits of lords and ladies just cause. And they weren't illustrations. They were commissions. I just think that this term it's being used loosely to try to put people down, where it doesn't belong.
That's basically what it is. It's a witch hunt. And whenever I've seen this happen in the art world, it's usually just a bunch of insecure, like you said, it's a colleague. And in my mind, I'm like, okay, so what exactly has this colleague done? Has he put artwork out there? Has he put himself out there? Has he faced the arena? Or is he just pointing at something and like, well, that's not. So like, if you are out there and you're creating your stuff, it doesn't matter if somebody else is pointing a finger and saying that it's not art or it is whatever, because that's just an argument that holds no water whatsoever. That is my biggest issue when it comes to people criticizing other people in the art world. It's like, unless you've been in the arena, you need to shut your mouth.
This argument is kind of befitting of a response along the lines of, your mom's an illustration.
Yeah.
She's probably a great one. What do I know? Because I only work in the applied arts category.
Right. You're just applied arts. You're not fine art. Let them all have the argument about whether or not something is fine art, because to tell you the truth, nobody's going to be able to tell you definitively what fine art is. Is fine art a urinal with a signature on it? Is fine art a can of poo? What is fine art? And there might be some people that disagree with us, or illustration's not fine art, and I'll be like, okay, whatever. Believe what you want. Believe what you want. Just don't do that to put people down. Don't do that.
Yeah. We've been arguing since time immemorial what's fine art. There were some people that argued that, well, cave paintings are illustrations and not fine art. And I'm like, they definitely didn't have those arguments. Like, like you were doing a handprint on the cave.
And somebody was
and
like...
I came up and I was like...
Well, that's not...
Tell our story for all of history, but just know...
that's just an illustration. And I'm sure that a lot of people might disagree. I'm more positive that a lot of our people here would agree. Just create the art. Don't worry about what somebody else is doing. This
whole thing is based on the one explicit rule, of course, that everyone knows about fine art.
Okay.
Which is that the only true fine art is art that is done in oils, which is tacked and not stapled on the back, of course, in a frame which has been hand-hewn and gilded with the finest of gildings, which was painted at sunrise or sunset. I mean, we're not trying to be too rigid here.
Right.
In a rural countryside. Oh, during standard time, not daylight saving time.
Right. Now that is fine art.
And therein lies the issue. Most likely, your colleagues, your friends, those people probably realized in looking at your work that they were done in daylight saving time, not standard time, and hence they were trying to save you. The utter embarrassment.
Yeah. Shame. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on the subject. Go ahead and leave that in the comment section below. And I want to give a big shout out to our patrons. This question would not have gotten so under my skin if it wasn't for the fact that somebody said that to one of my patrons. Man, you don't talk to the rogue artist that way.
So I guess define it how you want to, but stop using art terms as derogatory terms.
Yeah. And I'm probably going to end this video soon. Do you want to say goodbye?
Oh, yeah. Good day.
And thank you so much for watching, you guys. You guys are absolutely freaking amazing. I totally adore you. And if you like this and you want to watch more like this, just click right over here to subscribe. And that's it. I will say adios.